I only had a vague recollection of some of what I'd seen on the news years earlier about Nevada and Oregon. And so your family, the Bundy family, has had a ranch, if I understand correctly, in Nevada for a very long time, or lands that were leased to your family. So would you mind talking through the history of the Bundy family in Nevada and how much land you guys had, and give us a little bit of that backstory before I ask what happened?
Sure. So my family came into the Southern Nevada area in 1877. That's almost 150 years ago. I'm would be the fifth generation. So my children would be the sixth generation, even though we're not there. And so that gives you a little bit of perspective. They began immediately to run cattle on the foothills and to develop the valley for farming, agriculture, and was not an easy place to be. It was very arid. The people that were there prior to us left and said that the place was uninhabitable. And but my family made a go at it and survived there. And one of the things that they did is they found waters and springs on the foothills of the mountains there, and the state of Nevada was only a state for 13 years at that point. But they, in 1890, finally had a way to deed their waters and grazing rights. They were tied together. The water and the grazing rights were tied together. And my family went through the process to get the deeds, went through all the legal procedures to make sure that they were, claimed correctly and that the deeds were right with the state of Nevada. And then they continued to graze, on that land, and had the grazing rights to that land and the water rights to that land for 70 years. And then the Bureau of Land Management was established. So in 1946, the Bureau of Land Management was established. And it was fine. There was really nothing going on. The whole point of the Bureau of Land Management was to encourage people to use the land for, ranchers, miners, loggers, everybody to use the land. That was what their purpose was. But then in the 60s, it began after World War II and kind of moved into the 60s. The federal land agencies, such as the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they began to be infiltrated with basically extreme environmentalists that had a different view of what they wanted for the land. And then in the late 80s, they basically came to my father. This was after quite a bit of trouble, though, back and forth, because they were trying to, regulate and do certain things with the land, and there was a lot of trouble there because it was a conflict. And ultimately, then in the mid to late 80s, they began to try to claim that land and then control it as the owners of that land.
Who
And we're
tried
talking
to claim
about
it?
the Bureau of Land Management,
Okay.
the federal government. They tried to claim it and then to control it. And it was really a conflict for the people that were using the land because they had these deeds. They had mining claims. They had, in our case, we had grazing rights. And here you got the federal government saying that the land belongs to them and therefore they can control what goes on that land. And, we're looking for the state of Nevada to help us fight us because we have deeds with the state of Nevada, and the state of Nevada is not willing to bite the hand that feeds them because they're getting all this federal money. And so it kind of left it to the ranchers and the miners and the loggers and so forth to try to fight these battles, which really wasn't a fair fight. And then in the, right around the, early 1990s, Harry Reid was working on a project with a Chinese corporation to build one of the largest solar farms in the world. In fact, I think it was the largest solar farm, and it was 70, 80 miles from the Bundy Ranch.
Is that what I've seen? I mean, I've flown to California a number of times from various places, and I've seen a massive solar ranch that it seems to me is somewhere out in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. Is that what I'm seeing, or is it still a thing?
Well, probably. I do think they got part of it built, but I don't really know the development of it, to be honest with you, Matt. I don't know where it's at. I do know that there's a large one out there. I don't know if this is the one or not. But what happened is those solar farms, take up, thousands of acres, and I guess the wildlife can't live in it, and because of the heat or whatever. So the environmentalists got involved and said, well, we want to make the Bundy Ranch a mitigation area for the desert tortoise. And then they came in and they did a bunch of, to be honest with you, just fake studies showing that somehow the cattle and the desert tortoise cannot be in the same habitat, which was a lie, because the primary staple of the desert tortoise, nutrition was manure from the cattle, and that the true studies showed that, that wherever there was cattle, there was more desert tortoise, and when the cattle left, there was less desert tortoise. But they didn't care about that. It was politically motivated and theologically motivated as well. And so they decided to take our ranch and just make it into a desert tortoise mitigation area and drive all the ranchers off. Well, my dad had a problem with that because he had deeds with the state of Nevada. He had also ancestral rights that were established clear back in the 1800s. And then also constitutionally, there was no authority for the federal government to own mass amounts of land inside a state unless it was for military bases, post offices, and a few other enumerated powers. Reservations were one of them, Indian reservations. But nothing as far as owning, large amounts of land for no enumerated purpose. And so my dad began to try to rally the other ranchers. Some of them got involved. There was other ranchers that were, fighting, but it was just such a battle. I mean, you're fighting the U.S. government, and ultimately 52 out of 53 ranchers, stopped ranching in that area. One of them passed away and the others just kind of gave up, leaving my dad as the only one.
How long of a time period are we talking? You mentioned the 90s was kind of the last timestamp you've given us. What time frame are we talking now where over 50 of these ranchers have just essentially given up in this fight with the federal government?
I was born in 75, and growing up, there was many ranchers in that area. They were always working together and helping each other and sometimes fighting with each other. And, but we were a community. That's how I grew up. And then, probably shortly after, a few years after, because I went on a mission, as you mentioned, I came home, and I remember Keith Ney and my dad were the last two. This was probably maybe a year after I got off the mission, and Keith Ney passed away, leaving my dad. So we're talking like by 97, from the time I was born in 75 to 97, all 52 ranchers were gone, and my dad was the last one left in that area.